Perhaps I was just a little too confident in asserting that Irimui is Faputa's dad. That was just a quick video I made in the heat of the moment, and I think this topic deserves something a bit more fleshed out. After taking some time to reflect, I still believe that there's a strong case for it, but it's not the only plausible explanation. First off, I might have been wrong to think in such a naturalistic way and assume that everyone has a mother and a father. Maybe the cradles aren't natural, and even if they are, the nature of the setting already defies scientific explanation. But that's not to say it's the anything goes kind of magic that shows up in lazy writing. Well, it could be, but in an interview shown in theaters with the first Recap movie, Old Tusky indicates that he aspires to be better than that. I can't find a source for it, since nobody cares about Recap movies, but here's what I can remember. He said that what sets his series apart from typical fantasy is that he made sure to think of a cause for every effect. If you're working backward to find a cause, I suspect that you're likely to arrive at something resembling real-world science with a couple of miracles along the way to make it fit properly. I can't really state that with much certainty, that's just how I would do it. So, to draw inspiration from science, what if the moth is more like a genetically modified clone? Those aren't natural, but they do exist in real life. When a lab is developing a new gene mod, a lot of the time they'll clone a whole bunch of copies of the original and the modified organisms so they can run experiments that compare the behavior of the two groups. Plants clone themselves all the time, which is very convenient. It's trickier to clone an animal, but we still do it. Cloning a human shouldn't be any harder than cloning a sheep or a cow, but we're still too chicken to take it past the earliest stages. I guess because we still believe in souls somehow. And as for human gene modding, did you hear about that Chinese scientist who modified human embryos to be resistant to AIDS? Those embryos actually did make it all the way to birth, if you believe the Chinese government, which took control at some point in between. What an absolute hero. Based in transhuman, we need more people like him. This ties into something I mentioned in my previous video, about Irimui eating the flying creatures. I was saying that might work in a similar way to gene modding in real life. You see an organism with a trait you like, you figure out what part of the genetic code causes that trait, you extract that using a virus-derived tool called CRISPR, you insert it in another organism's genome, and then you just sort of hope that doesn't kill it. I've even done it myself. I would also say this is how all the villagers' bodies were made, even though the real-life practice tends to be on single cells like embryos. We're getting pretty figurative here, but consider that these Narahate are constructed anew, instead of being transformed like the natural ones, which is sort of like modifying the fundamental single cell. Throw in a miracle to transfer the mind while the old body is consumed, and you've got a sentient Narahate. Anyway, my point is that a gene-modded clone should be downright easy to make compared to some of the miracles that the Cradles Agreed casually grant, like the laws of nature are mere suggestions. So, this clone theory posits that there truly is no father, as Irimui's entire genome was copied, then mothified with various pieces of other things. The absence of a father was already the obvious way to look at it, but this explains it in a way that makes sense in real-life terms. Irimui has gone through certain changes, and who knows what that looks like genetically, but all it takes is one cell to store a copy of her old human form, so it's not hard to believe that the Cradle would make sure to keep track of it. I mean, this kid is no genetic engineer, so the only way she could control what's happening is if the Cradle hears her wish and figures out the details. Gene modding tells us how the child's skin is darker, but not why. She's never even seen the sun, despite smelling like it. Was it a side effect of some mod with an unrelated purpose? Did Irimui just want her to look exactly like that? If so, I must commend her on her character design. Much better than her first attempt. Now, one criticism I have of this theory is that leaning too heavily into science isn't really in the spirit of fantasy. It's not exactly wrong, but is it what Tsukushi would do? I doubt it, especially when I look at the way Narahate were made before we had magic eggs. Good luck explaining that. When Daruto talks about it, he sounds more like a shaman than a scientist, and we're not going to find a character more scientific than him. Virgin births being in the domain of man is very different from the way things used to be. It's not something that everyone's even aware of. Yesterday's miracles may be tomorrow's engineering feats, but there's no need to frame it that way in fiction. It's easier to just call it magic, so that's what tends to happen. Maybe that's not as interesting, but it does leave you with more time to draw nipples. One last thing, I'm not going to make another Star Wars reference just because clones are involved. Fuck Star Wars.